Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. And for the last few expansions, I've been known as somewhat of an altaholic. While the rogue remains my main all throughout Dragonflight, I couldn't just give up on all of the other classes that I got to test out throughout the beta and the alpha of Dragonflight. So I leveled every single class to max level, and I've been able to experience a variety of creative new builds with every single new raid tier. But the best part about playing all of these characters is being able to experience directly all of the class changes, talent additions, and even whole entire revamps that happen within major patches. It's always fun seeing how a class like a Demon Hunter, which was decent and okay, maybe even middling in Season 2, become an absolute monstrosity for a Season 3. And generally, I like seeing all of these playstyles get improved with every new revision. And seeing that our classes in the War Within, which should be releasing kind of soonish, at least the early alpha is, are about to gain a whole new slew of hero talents which will further change how some of them play, I do hope that we'll see a few more additions and a few more improvements before the actual release of the next expansion. While I'm no expert at most of these classes, and this is just going to be my opinions, I do want to go over some of the class specs that I think deserve some sort of a refresh or maybe even a rework either sometime before the Season 4 launch of Dragonflight, or at least before the official launch of the War Within expansion. But right before we go over this class list, most of you guys watching these kind of discussion videos are still not subscribed. However, the more of you remind, the more of you do, so let's keep it going. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell if you're watching these videos anyway, especially if you want to get more regular content regarding the next upcoming World of Warcraft expansion, The War Within. Let's start this off in an alphabetical order, starting with the class of Death Knight, and the recently reworked spec of the Unholy feels so good to play within the patch 10.2, where the spec didn't really see any major adjustments, just a bit of a rework when it comes to its overall focus, where we saw a decrease in some of its effective major cooldowns, such as summoning up the Gargoyle as well as your undead army, but we saw buffs towards some of your basic combat abilities to improve on the moment-to-moment Unholy Death Knight gameplay, which has benefited them in spaces like dungeons, and has allowed them to have a profile where they can feel more effective more often, changing them from a class that's effective every 3 minutes to one that's effective every 45 seconds. But such a small adjustment was enough to make Unholy feel more responsive, more interactive, and a ton more fun to pick up, especially for some of the new players who no longer had to deal with the minutiae of cooldowns. In comparison, the sister Frost Death Knight hasn't had too many great changes like Unholy. While Frost is generally fantastic in some of the longer, sustained cleave situations, that's effectively its only strength. And while the newer tier set is a lot of fun to play with, it still falls behind some of the other melee classes in the game. And I feel like some kind of a talent refresher, if not a revamp, would help Frost stand out better apart from the crowd. Then we have the class of Hunter, and for the patch 10.2, Beastmaster did see a few adjustments within its talent tree, but a handful of adjustments were enough to make the Call of the Wild build a lot more feasible. When it comes to the two range specs of the Hunter, Marksman and Beast Mastery, I don't have a lot of bad things to say. However, I would love to see a little bit more love shown to the Wailing Arrow ability, and I do hope in the future that talent gets a little bit more play, since currently most Marksman and Beastmaster Hunters have to choose between talents that amplify their damage or pick up the utility of Wailing Arrow, and in most situations, being able to do big damage wins out every single time. I would love to see maybe a situation where Wailing Arrow is removed from the spec tree and put back into the class tree, where you can simply and easily pick up some of the additional utility without having to give up any core damage options. But when it comes to Hunters, the most time that I spent on the Hunter has been playing the spec of Survival. And while by no means is Survival popular generally amongst the Hunter community, I do love its unique melee range hybridness that it has going on, where a good portion of the talents are not afraid to give you range-based options, even though at a core you're a melee playstyle. And that hybrid capability I feel like is the strength of Survival. However, a lot of those talents are very difficult to invest into without other talents to help reinforce them, which does force you to dedicate certain talent points in order to make those playstyles work. Then there's a bit of rigidity when it comes to some of their capstone choices like Coordinated Assault as well as Spearhead, how you can technically invest into both of these talents simultaneously, but this does create a situation where both playstyles clash against each other. And over the last few updates, we've seen Coordinated Assault be the leading pick compared to Spearhead, which has just been sitting there dormant since I think the first raid of Dragonflight. Because of these awkward interactions within the talent tree, I would love to see a revamp or even a talent overhaul for the spec of Survival. Ideally, I would love for the spec to regain its ability to play as a ranged or a melee, maybe as a very first choice node when you select the spec of survival, because you can technically cadaver yourself together a pseudo range version of survival that kinda works but will not deal nearly the same amount of damage as this melee counterpart, but the bones are there, and I feel like with a handful of talent adjustments you could help complete the ideal range survival dream again. However, realistically, I believe survival will likely still maintain its melee playstyle and focus, but even that version of survival could still use a bit of a facelift before the next expansion. Another class that I added when putting this list together was the class of Monk. First of all, I love Brewmaster Monk. I feel like it's a bit bloated when it comes to its overall base rotation, but it's incredibly fun to dive into dungeons. Then there's Mystery War Monks, which have become my most favorite healer to play in Mythic Plus dungeons, specifically ever since they became a meta pick for the 10.2. Windwalkers also have recently gotten buffed, which is great to see, and this recent adjustment does place them in a more competitive spot, especially when comparing them to melee classes like Demon Hunters and Rogues, for instance. Windwalkers, though, I think could use additional love going forward, and maybe even some kind of a stat scaling mechanic, since historically, monks, Windwalkers specifically, don't really scale well towards the end of an expansion. Most of the times, the spec relies on versatility to increase its base damage output, but most classes that utilize haste, mastery, or even critical strike to scale generally tend to do better towards the end of an expansion. A spec like Monk could use a talent refresher in order to help him create a better pathway going forward to find a way to get stronger as we get towards the end of an expansion. Another class I want to put on this list would be the Shaman, which has generally been a great class to pick up for the 10.2. But as more classes receive raid buffs, with the most recent one being Hunters, the class of Shaman does start to fall behind a little. While enhancement does bring its trusty Wind Fury totem for raids and dungeons, it does leave Restoration and Elemental Shamans bringing nothing to the table as of this moment. And this fact can snowball them into being less and less desirable unless specific raid fights directly fit their combat or healing profiles. I believe it would benefit both Restoration and Elemental Shamans if they got some kind of a talented rework. Maybe both of those playstyles should bring some kind of a party buff or raid buff through a totem similar to Enhanced with Shaman to maybe buff the output of some of the members of your party. Or maybe instead of bringing a unique totem that provides an additional buff, maybe both Restoration and Elemental could have some kind of a totem that mimics a buff that already exists in the game. For example, if let's say your raid is missing a Restoration Druid and you're missing Mark of the Wild, Resto Shamans could maybe get a totem that can mimic that same raid buff. Or if you're missing the Intellect buff from Mages, you could bring an Elemental Shaman with a totem that also mimics the same buff as well. This change would make Elemental and Restoration less mandatory to add into every single raid roster, which would make raid composition construction a little bit less rigid, while still allowing Restoration and Elemental Shamans to bring something to the table. Even though it's not necessarily new, I still think added flexibility could give both of those playstyles a little bit more additional value. The final spec I wanted to put on this list would be for the class of Warlock. Recently, we've seen Demonology see a bit of a rework similar to the Unholy Death Knights, where there's a much less focus on some of the bigger cooldowns on powerful demonic summons, such as the Tyrant or even the Pit Lord, but instead, all that focus has been re-injected back into the moment-to-moment gameplay, as well as some of the basic demons and new ways for you to be able to augment and adjust them. Destruction, on the other hand, could probably use some kind of a similar refresher, similar to that of Demonology, which feels fantastic to play. And don't get me wrong, I love Destruction Warlocks, just the general concept and the design, plus the fact that they added a way to make Cataclysm a viable talent pick for Mythic Plus content has made the spec feel so much more fun than ever before. However, when it comes to constructing a build for Destruction, I do think their talent tree specifically is rigid to play around, and it's very difficult to create a flexible talent setup all on your own. Whenever I pick up a new class, I love experimenting with some of the newer talents and some of the different options and just trying to construct a build all on my own, theory crafting things as I go. But eventually I will go back to some of the class guides to try some of the more meta builds to see how the class is meant to be played. However, that fun of experimentation is still there with every single playstyle, and every time I picked up Destruction, I found it very difficult to experiment with the talent options freely. since certain skills in your talent tree will require additional talent investment for you to reach a more powerful version of those abilities, but that talent rigidity makes it a little bit difficult to construct your own build, so you can have enough talent points to pick up some of your more powerful options towards the bottom rows of your talent tree. Destruction overall feels great to play in the patch 10.2, and it's a very enjoyable playstyle that I've loved for over the last few expansions, but I do think it would feel better if certain core talent abilities such as Havoc, Cleaving, or Rain of Fire, or even stuff like Conflagration were baseline abilities, so then you can spend your talent points in such a way to better customize your preferred playstyle and experience. And for now, that's going to be my list of classes that I do hope receives some kind of a rework or even a talent refresher before the very next expansion, or even earlier before the Season 4. Now I want to pass it off in the comments down below. Do you guys by chance have a class list of your own that you secretly wish does get some kind of a revamp or rework or a major adjustment before the next expansion? Because preferably, I believe it'll be much better for all of our classes to feel satisfying going forward into the next expansion, as we're about to get new tools and toys to play with within the hero talent system. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.